Continuing Alexander from Plutarch's Lives, translated by John Dryden, revised by Arthur Hugh Clough. This gave offense to the older men who were there, and they upbraided both the author and the singer of the verses, though Alexander and the younger men about him were much amused to hear them, and encouraged them to go on, till at last Cletus, who had drunk too much, was besides a forward and a wilful templar, was so nettled that he could hold no longer, saying it was not well to expose the Macedonians before the barbarians and their enemies, since though it was their unhappiness to be overcome, yet they were much better men than those who laughed at them. And when Alexander remarked that Cletus was pleading his own cause, giving cowardice the name of misfortune, Cletus started up. "This cowardice, as you are pleased to term it," said he to him, "saved the life of a son of the gods when in flight from Spithridat's sword. It is by the expense of the Macedonian blood and by these wounds that you are now raised to such a height as to be able to disown your father Philip and call yourself the son of Ammon." "Thou base fellow," said Alexander, who was now thoroughly exasperated, "dost thou think to utter these things everywhere of me, and stir up the Macedonians to sedition, and not be punished for it?" "We are sufficiently punished already," answered Cletus, "if this be the recompense of our toils, and we must esteem theirs a happy lot who have not lived to see their countrymen scourged with Median rods, and forced to sue the Persians to have access to their king." While he talked thus at random, and those near Alexander got up from their seats and began to revile him in turn, the elder men did what they could to compose the disorder. Alexander, in the meantime, turning about to Xenodocus the Parthian and Artemius the Colophonian, asked him if they were not of opinion that the Greeks, in comparison with the Macedonians, behaved themselves like so many demigods among wild beasts. But Cletus, for all this, would not give over, desiring Alexander to speak out if he had anything more to say, or else why did he invite men who were freeborn and accustomed to speak their minds openly without restraint to sup with him? He had better live and converse with barbarians and slaves who would not scruple to bow the knee to his Persian girdle and his white tunic, which word so provoked Alexander that, not able to suppress his anger any longer, he threw one of the apples that lay upon the table at him and hit him, and then looked about for his sword. But Aristophanes, one of his lifeguard, had hid that out of the way, and others came about him and besought him, but in vain. For, breaking from them, he called out aloud to his guards in the Macedonian language, which was a certain sign of some great disturbance in him, and commanded a trumpeter to sound, giving him a blow with his clenched fist for not instantly obeying him, though afterwards the same man was commended for disobeying an order which would have put the whole army into tumult and confusion. Cletus, still refusing to yield, was with much trouble forced by his friends out of the room, but he came in again immediately at another door, very irreverently and confidently singing the verses out of Euripides's Andromache. "In Greece, alas, how ill things ordered are." I don't know what the form is because, they spell Greek with the K. Not the, Upon this, at last, Alexander, snatching a spear from one of the soldiers, met Cletus. It was as he was coming forward and putting by the curtain that hung before the door, and ran him through the body. He fell at once with a cry and a groan, upon which the king's anger immediately vanishing, he came perfectly to himself, and when he saw his friends about him, all in a profound silence, he pulled the spear out of the dead body, and would have thrust it into his own throat if the guards had not held his hands, and by main force carried him away into his chamber, where all that night and the next day he wept bitterly, till, being quite spent with lamenting and exclaiming, he lay, as it were, speechless, only fetching deep sighs. His friends, apprehending some harm from his silence, broke into the room, but he took no notice of what any of them said, till Aristander, putting him in mind of the vision he had seen concerning Cletus and the prodigy that followed, as if all had come to pass by an unavoidable fatality. He then seemed to moderate his grief. Well, sometimes you be careful about relaying your visions to one. You kind of have at least, whether you share the interpretation with it or whatever. But if it's something bad's going to happen, perhaps the fact that that idea is out there makes a difference of it happening. They now brought Cleisthenes, the philosopher, who was the near friend of Aristotle and Anaxarchus, and of Abdera to him. Cleisthenes used moral language and gentle and soothing means, hoping to find access for words of reason and get a hold upon the passion. But Anaxarchus, who had always taken a course of his own in philosophy, and had a name for despising and slighting his contemporaries, as soon as he came in, cried aloud, "Is this Alexander, whom the whole world looks to, lying here weeping like a slave for fear of the censure and reproach of men, to whom he himself ought to be a law and a measure of equity? If he would use the right his conquest had given him as supreme lord and governor of all, and not be the victim of vain and idle opinion, do not you know," said he, "that Jupiter is represented to have justice and law on each hand of him, to signify that all the actions of a conqueror are lawful and just?" Well, that can't be true, but with these and the like speeches, Anaxarchus indeed allayed the king's grief, but withal corrupted his character, rendering him more audacious and lawless than he had been. Nor did he fail these means to insinuate himself into his favor, and to make Cleisthenes' company, which at all times, because of his austerity, was not very acceptable, more uneasy and disagreeable to him. It happened that these two philosophers met at an entertainment, where conversation turned on the subject of climate and the temperature of the air. Cleisthenes joined with their opinion, who held that those countries were colder, and the winter sharper there than in Greece. Anaxarchus would by no means allow this, but argued against it with some heat. "Surely," said Cleisthenes, "you cannot but admit this country to be colder than Greece, for there you used to have but one threadbare cloak to keep out the coldest winter, and here you have 3 good warm mantles, one over another." This piece of raillery irritated Anaxarchus and the other pretenders to learning, and the crowd of flatterers in general could not endure to see Cleisthenes so much admired and followed by the youth, and no less esteemed by the older men for his orderly life and his gravity, and for being contented with his condition, and confirming that he had professed about the object he had in his journey to Alexander, that it was only to get his countrymen recalled from banishment, and to rebuild and repopulate and repeople his native town. Besides the envy which his great reputation raised, he also by his own deportment gave those who wished him ill opportunity to do him mischief, for when he was invited to public entertainments, he would most times refuse to come, or if he were present at any, he put a constraint upon the company by his austerity and silence, which seemed to intimate his disapproval of what he saw, so that Alexander himself said, in application to him, that vain pretense to wisdom I detest, where a man's blind to his own interest. Being with many more invited to sup with the king, he was called upon, when the cup came to him, to make an oration extempore in praise of the Macedonians, and he did it with such a flow of eloquence that all who heard it rose from their seats to clap and applaud him, and threw their garland upon him. Only Alexander told him out of Euripides, I wonder not that you have spoken so well. 'Tis easy on good subjects to excel. Therefore, said he, if you will show the force of your eloquence, tell my Macedonians their faults, and dispraise them, that by hearing their errors they may learn to be better for the future. Callisthenes presently obeyed him, retracting all that he had said before, and inveighing against the Macedonians with great freedom, added that Philip thrived and grew powerful, chiefly by the discord of the Grecians, applying this verse to him. In civil strife e'en villains rise to fame, which so offended the Macedonians that he was odious to them ever after. And Alexander said that instead of his eloquence, he had only made his ill will appear in what he had spoken. Hermippus assures us that one Stroebus, a servant whom Callisthenes kept read to him, gave this account of these passages afterwards to Aristotle, and that when he perceived the king grow more and more averse to him, 2 or 3 times as he was going away, he repeated the verses, Death seized at last on great Patroclus too, though he in virtue far exceeded you. Not without reason, therefore, did Aristotle give this character of Callisthenes, that he was indeed a powerful speaker, but had no judgment. He acted certainly a true philosopher's part, in positively refusing, as he did, to pay adoration, and by speaking out openly against that which the best and gravest of the Macedonians only repined at in secret, he delivered the Grecians and Alexander himself from being a disgrace when the practice was given up, but he ruined himself by it, because he was too roughly to work, as if he would have forced the king to that which he should have effected by reason and persuasion. Charles of Mitylene writes that at a banquet Alexander, after he had drunk, reached the cup to one of his friends, who on receiving it rose up towards the domestic altar, and when he had drunk, first adored and then kissed Alexander, and afterwards laid himself down at the table with the rest, which they all did one after another, till it came to Callisthenes' turn, who took the cup and drank, while the king, who was engaged in conversation with Hephaestion, was not observing, and then came and offered to kiss him, but Demetrius, surnamed Phaedon, interposed, saying, Sir, by no means let him kiss you, for he only of us all has refused to adore you. Upon which the king declined it, and all the concern Callisthenes showed was that he said aloud, Then I go away with a kiss less than the rest. The displeasure he incurred by this action procured credit for Hephaestion's declaration that he had broken his word to him in not paying the king the same veneration that the others did. as he had faithfully promised to do. Now, well, I guess maybe there's some worse way to eat, but don't eat and drink on your left side, laying down, and because there was just somebody prop themselves up like that and eat, and yeah, that's not a healthy. That's a And to finish his disgrace, a number of such men as Lysimachus and Hagnon now came in with their asseverations that the sophist went about everywhere boasting of his resistance to arbitrary power, and that the young men all ran after him and honored him as the only man among so many thousands who had the courage to preserve his liberty. Therefore, when Hermolaus's conspiracy came to be discovered, the charges which his enemy brought against him were the more easily believed, particularly that when the young man asked him what he should do to be the most illustrious person on earth, he told him the readiest way was to kill him who was already so, and that to incite him to commit the deed, he bade him not to be awed by the golden couch, but remember Alexander was a man equally infirm and vulnerable as another. However, none of Hermolaus's accomplices in the utmost extremity made any mention of Callisthenes' being engaged in the design. Nay, Alexander himself, in the letters which he wrote soon after to Craterus, Attalus, and Alcetus, tells them that the young men who were put to the torture declared they had entered into the conspiracy of themselves, without any others being privy to or guilty of it. But yet afterwards, in a letter to Antipater, beside he accuses Callisthenes. The young men, he says, were stoned to death by the Macedonians. But for the sophist, meaning Callisthenes, I will take care to punish him with them too, who sent him to me, and who harbor those in their cities who conspire against my life. An unequivocal declaration against Aristotle, in whose house Callisthenes, for his relationship's sake, being his niece, Hero's son, had been executed. His death is variously related. Some say he was hanged by Alexander's orders, others that he died of sickness in prison, but Carus writes that he was kept in chains 7 months, and after he was apprehended on purpose that he might be proceeded against in full council, when Aristotle should be present, and that growing very fat, and contracting a disease of vermin, he there died about the time that Alexander was wounded in India, in the country of Mali Oxydraca, all of which came to pass afterwards. For to go on in order, Demaratus of Corinth, now quite an old man, had made a great effort about this time to pay Alexander a visit, and when he had seen him, said he pitied the misfortune of those Grecians who were so unhappy as to die before they had beheld Alexander seated on the throne of Darius. But he did not long enjoy the benefit of the king's kindness for him, and otherwise than that soon after falling sick and dying, he had a magnificent funeral, and the army raised him a monument of earth 80 cubits high, and of a vast circumference. His ashes were conveyed in a very rich chariot, drawn by 4 horses, to the seaside. Alexander, now intent upon his expedition into India, took notice that his soldiers were so charged with booty that it hindered their marching. Therefore, at break of day, as soon as the baggage wagons were laden, first he set fire to his own, and then to those of his friends, and then commanded those to be burnt which belonged to the rest of the army, an act which in the deliberation of it has seemed more dangerous and difficult than it proved in the execution, with which few were dissatisfied. For most of the soldiers, as if they had been inspired, uttering loud outcries and warlike shoutings, supplied one another with what was absolutely necessary, and burnt and destroyed all that was superfluous. the sight of which redoubled Alexander's zeal and eagerness for his design. And indeed he was now grown very severe and inexorable in punishing those who committed any fault, for he put Menander, one of his friends, to death for deserting a fortress where he had placed him in garrison, and shot Ursadats, one of the barbarians who revolted from him, with his own hand. At this time a sheep happened to yean a lamb with the perfect shape and color of a tiara upon the head, and testicles on each side. That's quite the birthmark, right? Which portent Alexander regarded with such dislike that he immediately caused his Babylonian priest, whom he usually carried about with him for such purposes, to purify him, and told his friends he was not so much concerned for his own sake as for theirs, out of an apprehension that after his death the divine power might suffer his empire to fall into the hands of some degenerate, impotent person. But this fear was soon removed by a wonderful thing that happened not long after, and was thought to presage better. For Proxenus, a Macedonian, who was the chief of those who looked to the king's furniture, as he was breaking up the ground near the river Oxus, to set up the royal pavilion, discovered a spring of a fat, oily liquor, which, after the top was taken off, ran pure, clear oil without any difference, either of taste or smell, having exactly the same smoothness and brightness, and that, too, in a country where no olives grew. The water, instead of the river Oxus, is said to have been the smoothest of the feeling of all waters, and to leave a gloss on the skins of those who bathed themselves in it. Whatever might be the cause, certain it is that Alexander was wonderfully pleased with it, as appears by his letters to Antipater, where he speaks of it as one of the most remarkable passages that God had ever favored him with. The diviners told him it signified his expedition would be glorious in the event, but very painful, and attended with many difficulties. For oil, they said, was bestowed on mankind by God as a refreshment of their labors. Nor did they judge amiss, for he exposed himself to many hazards in the battles which he fought, and received very severe wounds, but the greatest loss in his army was occasioned through the unwholesomeness of the air and the want of necessary provisions, but he still applied himself to overcome fortune and whatever opposed him by resolution and virtue, and thought nothing impossible to true intrepidity. On the other hand, nothing secure or strong for cowardice. It is told of him that when he besieged Sisimithras, who held an inaccessible, impregnable rock against him, and his soldiers began to despair of taking it, and asked Oxyartes whether Sisimithras was a man of courage, who, assuring him was the greatest coward alive, assuring him he was the greatest coward alive, then you tell me, said he, that the place may easily be taken, for what is in command of it is weak. And in a little time he so terrified Sisimithras that he took it without any difficulty. At an attack which he made upon such another precipitous place with some of his Macedonian soldiers, he called to one whose name was Alexander, and told him he at any rate must fight bravely, if it were but for his name's sake. The youth fought gallantly, and was killed in the action at which he was sensibly afflicted. Another time, seeing his men march slowly and unwillingly to the siege of the place called Nussa, because of the deep river between them and the town, he advanced before them, and standing upon the bank, "What a miserable man," said he, "am I that have not learned to swim," and then was hardly dissuaded from endeavoring to pass it upon his shield. Here, after the assault was over, the ambassadors, who from several towns which he had locked up came to submit to him and make their peace, were surprised to find him still in his armor, without any one in waiting or attendance upon him, and when at last someone brought him a cushion, he made the eldest of them, named Acaphis, take it and sit down upon it. The old man, marveling at his magnanimity and courtesy, asked him what his countrymen should do to merit his friendship. I would have them, said Alexander, choose you to govern them, and send 100 of the most worthy men among them to remain with me as hostages. Acaphis laughed and answered, I shall govern them with more ease, sir, if I send you so many of the worst rather than the best of my subjects. The extent of King Taxilus's dominions in India was thought to be as large as Egypt, abounding in good pastures and producing beautiful fruits. The king himself had the reputation of a wise man, and at his first interview with Alexander, he spoke to him in these terms. To what purpose, said he, should we make war upon one another? If the design of your coming into these parts be not to rob us of our water or our necessary food, which are the only things that wise men are indispensably obliged to fight for. As for the other riches and possessions, as they are accounted in the eye of the world, if I am better provided for, if I'm better provided of them than you, I am ready to let you share with me. But if fortune has been more liberal to you than me, I have no objection to be obliged to you. This discourse pleased Alexander so much that, embracing him, do you think, said he to him, your kind words and courteous behavior will bring you off in this interview without a contest? No, you shall not escape so. I shall contend and do battle with you so far, that, how obliging soever you are, you shall not have the better of me. Then, receiving some presents from him, he returned him others of great value, and to complete his bounty, gave him in money ready coined 1,000 talents, at which his old friends were much displeased, but it gained them the hearts of many of the barbarians. I don't like calling them foreigners or something barbarians, but they just mean their language was not the same. But the best soldiers of the Indians, now entering into the pay of several of the cities, undertook to defend them, and did it so bravely that they put Alexander to a great deal of trouble, till at last, after a capitulation, upon the surrender of the place, he fell upon them as they were marching away, and put them all to the sword. This one breach of his word remains as a blemish upon his achievements in war, which he otherwise had performed throughout with that justice and honor that became a king, nor was he less incommoded by the Indian philosophers, who inveighed against those princes who joined his party, and solicited the free nations to oppose him. He took several of these also, and caused them to be hanged. Alexander, and in his own letters, has given us an account of his war with Paris. He says the two armies were separated by the river Hydaspes, on whose opposite bank Porus continually kept his elephants in order of battle, with their heads towards the enemies, to guard the passage, that he, on the other hand, made every day a great noise and clamor in his camp, to dissipate the apprehensions of the barbarians, that one stormy dark night he passed the river at a distance from the place where the enemy lay, into a little island, with part of his foot and the best of his horse. Here there fell a most violent storm of rain, accompanied with lightning and whirlwinds, and seeing some of his men burnt and dying with the lightning, he nevertheless quitted the island and made over to the other side. The Hydaspes, he says, now for the storm was so swollen and grown so rapid as to have made a breach in the bank, and a part of the river was now pouring in here, so that when he came across it was with difficulty. He got a footing on the land, which was slippery and unsteady and exposed to the force of the currents on both sides. This is the occasion when he is related to have said, O ye Athenians, will ye believe what dangers I incur to merit your praise? This, however, is Onesicritus's story. Alexander, here the men left their boats and passed the breach in their armor up to the breast in water, and that then he advanced with his horse about 20 furlongs before his foot, concluding that if the enemy charged him with their cavalry, he should be too strong for them. If with their foot his own would come up enough to his assistance, nor did he judge amiss, for being charged by 1,000 horse and 60 armed chariots, which advanced before their main body, he took all the chariots and killed 400 horse upon the place. Porus, by this time guessing that Alexander himself had crossed over, came on with his whole army except a party, which he left behind to hold the rest of the Macedonians in play, if they should attempt to pass the river. But he, apprehending the multitude of the enemy, and to avoid the shock of their elephants, dividing his forces, attacked their left wing himself, and commanded Coenus to fall upon the right, which was performed with good success, for by this means, both wings being broken, the enemies fell back in their retreat upon the center, and crowded in upon their elephants. Their rallying, they fought a hand-to-hand battle, and it was the 8th hour of the day before they were entirely defeated. I presume they mean dividing sunrise to sunset into 8 hours, so afternoon, right? This description the conqueror himself has left us in his own epistles. Almost all the historians agree in relating that Porus was 4 cubits and a span high, and that when he was upon his elephant, so what was he, like 6'7" or something, which was of the largest size, his stature and bulk were so answerable that he appeared to be proportionately mounted as a horseman on his horse. This elephant, during the whole battle, gave many singular proofs of sagacity and a particular care for the king, whom, as long as he was strong and a condition to fight, he defended with great courage, repelling those who set upon him, and as soon as he perceived him overpowered with his numerous wounds and the multitude of darts that were thrown at him to prevent his falling off, he softly knelt down and began to draw out the darts with his proboscis. When Porus was taken prisoner, and Alexander asked him how he expected to be used, he answered, as a king. For that expression, he said, when the same question was put to him a second time, comprehended everything. And Alexander accordingly not only suffered him to govern his own kingdom as a satrap under himself, but gave him also the additional territory of various independent tribes, whom he subdued, a district which, it is said, contained 15 several nations and 5,000 considerable towns, besides abundance of villages. To another government 3 times as large as this, he appointed Philip, one of his friends. Well, maybe you don't have to go to that extent, but it does help setting a government that's not so single dictator oriented that you kind of delineate. That's why serfdom works so well.